Believe it or not, there are locations around the world that are incredibly unique and typically not accessible by the general public that actually have a Pokestop or a gym. In this video, I'm going to be going over a bunch of different Pokestops and gyms that you are probably never going to be able to spin. Alright, with that said, let's get right into it. Hey, how's it going everyone? It's me, it's Jinsula. I hope you're having a good day and welcome to today's Pokemon Go video. Today we're going to be talking about a bunch of Pokestops and gyms that a lot of players have reported existing, but they are completely inaccessible by the average player. Of course, the criteria for what is allowed to be a Pokestop or a gym have changed over time, so there is a chance that some of these points of interest don't even exist anymore. But I still find this idea to be interesting, that there are Pokestops and gyms that are out there that basically 99.999% of the world population will probably never get to. Alright, so let's get right into these locations. So the first location that I want to talk about is brought to us by a Redditor who was actually stationed at this location. According to them, there exists a cluster of Pokestops and gyms at McMurdo Station in Antarctica. This is of course a place that is only accessible by people who are researchers, who are government sanctioned, or of course wealthy people who can afford an excursion to these locations. These are Pokestops and gyms that basically nobody will ever be able to access. And I do find it extremely interesting that even in Antarctica, there is Pokemon Go, and that is a really profound thing. Now the next location that I want to talk about is actually a place that I've personally visited. It is at the peak of Seollak Mountain, which is in South Korea. This is a mountain that is located close to the town of Sokcho, which is at the northeast corner of the country. Now, there's plenty of Pokestops and gyms that exist at the peak of different mountains, but this one is incredibly unique because it's one of the first Pokestops and gyms that ever existed in the country of South Korea. Here's a bit of history. In case you didn't know, back in the day when Pokemon Go first launched, this was not available in the country of South Korea. Of course, nowadays, there's a booming community of Pokemon Go players in the country of South Korea, but back then it was extremely difficult to ever play. The reason for this is because the country of South Korea have a bunch of different sanctions for what kind of navigation apps are allowed in the country. And of course, back then, Google Maps was the foundation for Pokemon Go, and it was one of the apps that was not allowed. But interestingly, in the far northeast corner of the country, it was actually kind of off the grid. And because of that, Pokemon Go was actually enabled in that one small town. Now, if you were to drive a couple of miles away from the town, you would go to a place called Seoraksang Mountain. This mountain is very unique in that it is kind of a tourist trap for people who are visiting Korea. But interestingly enough, there's a bunch of Pokestops and gyms and a lot of rare spawns that were there. Me and my wife, as well as a good friend of mine who enjoyed Pokemon Go, went over to that mountain and we were enthralled by all of the rare spawns that were there. Back then, it was incredible if you were to come across any Snorlaxes, Laprases, or Dragonites, and this one mountain seemed to have all three of them. It's mainly because this mountain did not have any kind of biomes attached, so it had a bunch of spawns that you would typically not find, and it was an incredible experience. And then on top of that, at the very peak of this mountain, there was a Pokestop, and it had some of the most incredible views of the country. Some people even pointed out while we were there that you could even look into North Korea from that mountain, so that was also very interesting as well. Now, speaking of which, there is actually a cluster of Pokestops and gyms that are incredibly unique, and basically nobody is going to ever be able to go to it. Over at the Korea Demilitarization Zone, which is basically the border between North Korea and South Korea, there is actually a cluster of Pokestops and gyms. And the only way you can access this location is if you are a diplomat or a president. Yeah, it's incredible that there is actually Pokestops and gyms in this one location that is very hard to get to. Alright, next let's talk about some Pokestops and gyms that not a lot of players may not even know exists. And these are of course all of the Pokestops and gyms that exist in the various islands of the Maldives. Now, as part of my 5-year anniversary with my wife, I actually went to the Maldives, and I was actually very surprised that some of these little islands would have one little gym or Pokestop within those islands. Something you need to know about the Maldives is that it is a cluster of about 1,000 tiny islands, and every resort at the Maldives is basically its own island. In other words, in order to access some of these Pokestops and gyms, you need to fly to the main island of the Maldives, and then you need to take a small water plane to the various islands. And that is how you can spin one of those Pokestops and gyms. And something to keep in mind is that not every single one of those islands will actually have any kind of Pokemon Go activity. It's a very few number of them that will actually have any kind of points of interest. Now, the next location might actually be really surprising to you. There's actually a Pokestop and gym inside the exclusion zone of Chernobyl. Yeah, that's right. If you were to ever go to Chernobyl, you would actually find Pokemon Go content there. Now the next gym is a bit of a legend. It's at a place called Pyramiden in Russia. This is actually a small mining colony island that was inaccessible by the general public. And even if you got there, you would have no cell service or no Wi-Fi. So from a technical standpoint, it was impossible to spin these gyms in the first place. From what I heard, over time, Niantic actually removed the gym that was at this island. But at the time when it did exist, this was one of the most incredible gyms you could ever come across. Alright, and finally, the last location that I wanted to talk about is, of course, the one gym in the middle of the Pentagon. This is incredibly interesting because there's no way to access this one gym unless you are a government official or an employee at the Pentagon. And yeah, I do find it very interesting that there are players out there who have actually had gold badges from this gym, and there are people who claim that they could reach it from outside, but you simply cannot. There's no way to access this gym unless you're a government official, or maybe you're on tour at the Pentagon, but considering this is one of the most secure facilities in the world, it's very doubtful that you would ever get there legitimately. But every now and then, I would actually hear stories of players who would kind of GPS drift over to that gym, and they would be able to spin it and collect a postcard from it. But I have my doubts and I have my suspicions that maybe they're spoofing, but I do find it interesting that this one gym exists. So yeah, there you have it. These were some of the most unique and interesting gyms and Pokestops that I've heard about, and some that I've actually visited. And I always find this topic interesting that players will discover different Pokestops and gyms like this. Because yeah, like anyone else, I would love to visit one of these Pokestops and gyms one day and collect a postcard from them. But I do not know if I'll ever be able to. Like the cluster in Antarctica, I would love to visit that one day. That's probably a huge bucket list for me. Like personally, I've done a lot of research on how to actually go to Antarctica. And yeah, I basically just need to get a lot of money. And there's like this whole training regimen and stuff, but I think that would be incredible. Imagine one day I make a vlog where I play Pokemon Go in Antarctica. That would be insane. But yeah, in any case, that's going to be it for this video. I would love to know your thoughts regarding everything that I talked about down below. Definitely share those unique locations and Pokestops that you've come across in the comments below. And yeah, let's talk about it because I do think this topic is so interesting. And thank you so much for making it to this point in the video. If you ended up enjoying it, make sure you hit that thumbs up button and subscribe if it's your first time here. And don't forget that little bell so you can stay up to date on whenever I upload videos. And I want to give a quick shout out to all the members of my Patreon family. You make this channel content possible. If you want to support my channel in any way, big or small, then make sure you go and check out the links in the description below. For all of my Patreon members, they get a permanent spot on my in-game friends list. So if you want to interact with me in some way within Pokemon Go, like with remote raids or the friendship system, then make sure you go and check out my Patreon. Also, if you want to support my channel non-monetarily, you could always do so by following me on social media. My handle is @Jinsula, and I'm on the following platforms. Alright, and with that said, that's going to be it. I'm Jinsula. Be safe, have fun, love yourself, and I'll catch you all later.